So we're going to lecture through all of the things that could be wrong on your ECG. To determine that your ECG is normal, we have to exclude any abnormalities, which means you've got to go through P waves to make sure that your APR are correct. You've got to do things like PR interval to make sure that your AD mode is working correctly. You've got to do things like, is the QRS the right shape to make sure ventricular depolarization is correct. The first one is really easy. The first one, what we're going to do is just look at heart rate. And because it's sinus rhythm, technically you're supposed to look at P waves, because the sine atrio node, sinus rhythm, or it kicks up atrial depolarization. So technically we're looking at P waves, but you can use R waves too, because essentially what we're doing is heart rates. You can obviously do it with pulse too. A heart rate that's over 100 is called tachycardia. A heart rate that's below 60 is called bradycardia. There's all kinds of things that can cause bradycardia and tachycardia, everything from hormonal imbalances, nutritional imbalances, ion imbalances, all kinds of things. If you would like more information, if you download this and click on those links, you'll see examples. You can also go over to Wikipedia, because there's a nice write-up on what could cause bradycardia and tachycardia. What we care about is essentially what is your heart rate. We're going to do it kind of a really quick way to do it, and then a little bit more accurate. The quick way to do it is to divide the number of big blocks between R waves or between P waves from 300. If you're an EMT, to be honest, you generally just memorize the sequence. I'm going to write this somewhere where it doesn't matter. 300, 150, 100, 75, 60. So if there's one big block between R waves, heart rate is 300. If there's two big blocks between R waves, heart rate is 150. 3 would be 100, 4 would be 75, and 5 would be 60. First of all, what do you mean by big blocks? I mean, this is a big block. And then this little guy here, when I say little block, I mean this. When I say big block, I mean this. So what you're going to do for the quickest way to look at heart rate is say, line up one that's with a lined up, try and find one that's lined up. Say this is one big block, two big blocks, three big blocks. If it would have lined up right there, we'd say it's 300 divided by 3, so the heart rate is 100. If it would have lined up right there, we would have said 300 divided by 4, so the heart rate is 75. We can just estimate and say it's somewhere between 75 and 100. So it looks to be, I'll just guess, something like 80 beats per minute. If you're like, no, that's not close enough, then what you can do then is you can take the small blocks and divide from 1500. So you take, this is 5, 10, 15, 16, 17, 18 small blocks. 1500 divided by 18 is 83. Let's say 18. The heart rate is 83 beats per minute. So the quick way is big blocks from 300. The more accurate way is 1500 divided by small blocks to get your heart rate. Then you'll come back over here and you'll say what is the rate of your R waves, and you put in your heart rate, and hopefully it's between 60 and 100. So that's the easy one. What's your normal sinus rhythm? Everyone have that? So now we're going to start drawing. We're going to look at something called Qrs Axis. And this Blaufus is a nice site to go to, because it will actually allow you to see how changes in ventricular depolarization will change the Qrs axis. We're going to draw this on the board though. Why it matters. Trying to get it for the camera. The first thing is essentially what you're looking at is apical depolarization. Because if you see changes in apical depolarization, it could mean that there's extra muscle growth over here, or could mean death over here. So any kind of change in muscle thickness is going to change apical depolarization. So that's essentially what we're looking at. So if I put right in the middle a heart, apical depolarization is voltage comes down the septum and heads up the walls. And because the ECG doesn't pick these all up individually, it adds them together. The way this is seen by the ECG is one big arrow heading down the heart. So that's the normal situation. You can imagine, though, if you have a heart that has added extra muscle on this side, so if it has left-sided hypertrophy, and that could be caused by hypertension, so the heart is always trying to pump blood into a vessel system that has high blood pressure. You're going to add muscle to this side. In that case, there's going to be more voltage going in this direction because there's all that extra muscle. Same amount going in this direction. Now all of a sudden your voltage vector is going to pick up more of this flow, and so your voltage vector will head in this direction. That's supposed to be an arrow. Another thing that can cause the axis to shift to the left is if there's loss of tissue on this side. So if this side is thinned, and now you have less voltage going in this direction, since this is a tug of war, so to speak, if you lose tissue on this side, that also will cause the voltage vector to shift to the left. So it could be loss of tissue on right. Both of those can cause a leftward deviation of the QRS axis. I'm going to draw another normal one down here, because eventually I'm going to clutter this one up a little bit. Again, normal would be the voltage vector is heading towards the apex of the heart. So it's heading towards the apex. Just to add in, just as an example, left hypertrophy again could be caused by hypertension. You have a similar shift to the right, and everything is going to be kind of the opposite. So if you have a heart that has additional muscle on this side, so right-sided hypertrophy, or again, so right-sided hypertrophy would mean more voltage goes in this direction now. Or you could have loss of some of the tissue on the left, which would shift the balance and cause this voltage vector to go in this direction. So loss of tissue on left. So again, this is a tug of war. Anything that adds voltage to this side because you've added muscle, or anything that causes loss of voltage on this side because tissue has died, is going to shift this arrow in this direction. You're going to see a right-sided deviation. The worst of all situations is called northwest, or it's also called no man's land. What happens here is normally, again, most of your voltage heads up the left, some heads up the right. If you had a massive heart attack where this tissue was not receiving blood, and therefore that muscle was not electrical, was not conducting electricity because you haven't washed out the ions, then the only thing you have left at that point is this guy, which means your voltage axis is heading in this direction. And that would be a very bad thing. Because again, it indicates that there's something huge going on the left. You may be asking now, well, what would be normal? How do you judge normal? What is mine? You essentially put a circle around this and you say, this is going to be 0. I'm just going to call this 0, or somebody decided to call this 0. And this is 180. So that makes this 90. And this is called minus 90. So this would be 30, 60, 120. This would be minus 30, minus 60, minus 120. You want your deviation somewhere between minus 30, and some say 90, and some say 100. Everywhere over here is okay. And the truth of the matter is everybody's heart can be a little bit different. And so as long as your axis is always where it is, then you're probably fine as long as you're walking around. And I say that as a PhD, not MD, obviously. The problem is if Henniger gets his ECG at 25 and his axis is right here, and he comes back and gets his ECG at 35 and his axis is here, comes back and gets his EKG at 45 and his axis is here, it means something is changing in the muscle structure to make the axis shift. And the most likely thing is he's got hypertension that's not been treated. And I'm thinking in my head right now of those images we looked at the first day of this class where we saw a heart that was really enlarged and too muscular, and then it started to hollow out and dilate. We're adding muscle, which sounds like a great thing, but eventually you're not going to get enough blood flow to the muscle on the inside, and so your heart's going to start dying from the inside out. So that's one of the problems. Going back to what we just kind of covered, I don't expect you to be able to pull your QRS axis right off of yours, but it is pretty easy to get an idea of where the axis is if you just remember that you have 3 leads. This is lead 1, this is lead 2, and this is lead 3. A quick and easy way to kind of determine the axis, I don't want to waste mental capital today on telling you exactly how to do it. But if you want to know, I can tell you pretty closely how to get your actual Qrs axis just by looking at it. But on a rough level, you can say, if my axis is heading in this direction, that's very parallel to lead 2. And so if my lead 2 is largest, then my axis is somewhere around 70. It's around 80. So you're okay and you're here normal if lead 2 is largest. If your axis is over in this direction, then that voltage vector is most parallel to lead 1. Lead 2 would actually be kind of flat because this is running perpendicular to lead 2. So if your lead 1 is largest, you're tilting over towards the left. Obviously, most of you probably aren't tilting all the way up to minus 30, but some of you might have a bigger lead 1 than you have lead 2. Over here, the best lead to pick up a voltage vector in this direction is lead 3. And so if lead 3 is the largest, it means you have a rightward deviation. And those are slight subtle changes over time that you want to be worried about. One, if there's no subtle change over time, if you see this, you need to do something about it quick. Because if you see lead 2 is upside down, then that indicates that you're in no man's land. Lead 2 is pointing in this direction. The voltage vector here is pointing in the opposite direction. So that means the voltage change is going to be negative. negative QRS or an upside down QRS in lead 2 is an indication that there's a problem in the left ventricle. The only thing you're catching is right ventricle activity, and that person's in trouble. Qrs Axis is one of the important ones that I'd like to get, and that's one that I think is fair and practical. How you will determine your Qrs Axis is I would recommend you go to the Blaufuse website and look, twist this arrow until essentially you've lined up lead 1 is the tallest. If lead 1 is the tallest, then you're up here, you're left shifted. If lead 2 is the tallest, you're down in the 60 to 70. If lead 3 is the tallest, you're over in 120. So I have a student from the previous class, and it looks kind of like lead 1 and lead 2 are the same, and lead 3 is relatively flat. That's going to be common for a lot of you. So you would rotate until lead 1 and lead 2 are roughly the same. Lead 3 is called isoelectric, they're roughly flat, and your axis would be around 30. You could go, depending on if 1 is a little bit bigger or 2 is a little bit bigger, you're going to be in that 15 to 45 range. So what you will do for your lab is figure out the degree of your Qrs Axis and write it down. The next one we're going to do is, do you have normal P waves? And essentially we're looking at the height and the width. So again, the P wave is this guy right here. What it represents, this is a heart. It's atrial depolarization. Essentially, you can have two problems. One, it can be too large. So in that case, you have a really large P wave. The other thing that you can have is too long. So it's too wide, it's too long. So you're going to measure from the beginning of your P wave to the end of your P wave. What happens when it's too large are a couple of things. The simplest way to think about it is you've added more muscle. If you add more muscle, then you have more voltage. So that can make it larger. The other thing I talked about when we went over ECG was normally this vector is pointing in this direction. And so lead 2 is best able to see it. 1 sees it, but it's more perpendicular to lead 1. If we add extra voltage over here, then now this vector, voltage vector, is kind of heading in this direction. Now it would be larger, the P wave would be larger in 1 than in 2. So here, the P wave is more perpendicular to 2, so the P wave would be more large in lead 2. Here, since I've added voltage over here, and you can add voltage over there if you have something like mitral stenosis. So mitral stenosis, the mitral valve is hardened. It's hard to get blood through that mitral valve, so the left atrium becomes stronger. That means more voltage heads in that direction. So in the tug of war of how the ECG picks up all these voltage changes, the voltage vector shifts in this direction. All of a sudden now, lead 1 is better able to see the P wave than lead 2. So a P wave in 1 greater than in 2 could indicate that you have too large of a P wave, that you have hypertrophy of the left atrium. too long. It's a tiny little pathway. You're just depolarizing the atria and then you're done. So it should be a short little up and down. If you have a long P wave, it means you took a long path. And that likely means that you started at the SA node and you went all the way down into the ventricle. So a long P wave means a long voltage path, which means you probably went down into the ventricle. You bypassed the AV node. A condition that does that is something called Wolff-Parkinson White's. So some of the current goes straight from the right atrium down into the ventricle. That could cause too long. When we're looking at short EKG, we'll want to measure how many boxes wide your P wave is and how tall it is. First thing is heights. Each one of the little blocks is 1 millimeter, so you want it to be less than 2.5 blocks high. The width, each one of those small blocks is 0.04 seconds. So you want to be right at around less than 3 blocks, because 3 blocks would be 0.12 seconds, and you want to be less than 0.12.
What did you say the boxes were?
0.04 seconds. So I'm going to say this is the beginning of my P, and this is the end of my P, and I count that as 2 blocks. Each block is 0.04 seconds. So the duration of this P wave is 0.08 seconds, which is great. It's not too long. I also look at the height. It's maybe 1.5 blocks high, so it's definitely not too large. So put the height of your blocks here, and the width in seconds. So if it's 1 block, it's 0.04 seconds. If it's 2 blocks, 0.08. If it's 3, it's 0.12. If it's 4, it was nice knowing you. If it's 5, just kidding. So that is P waves. I'm going to do something fairly similar now, which is what is your normal PR interval?